Welcome to a brief introduction on maps and OSINT, or open source intelligence, using maps in historical and real world investigations. It's Friday the 13th, 2026, February the 13th. What we're going to do today is there was an interesting historical case that we were looking at, which ties into some kind of current news trends that we're looking at. And I thought it was a good opportunity to be able to kind of share some of the techniques that we use on open source maps. You don't have to have subscriptions. These are free. Everybody can go ahead and look at these, but they provide a level of detail that just going on Google Earth doesn't quite give you. And it's quite interesting. And it shows how sometimes the threads of information and history can lead to some other things that are absolutely fascinating, kind of those unknown history. So we thought it was kind of nice. We're going to share it. Should be about probably about 10 minutes on this one. If you have any questions, feel free to put in the comments what you like or what you want more information on, or if you have information about this. So you can share with everyone else. It's absolutely fascinating. And you'll be surprised at the end, the punchline of what this might actually tie into, and kind of how the client found this initially. So we'll begin actually in Northeast New Mexico. And if you're traveling down New Mexico Route 76, Highway 76, there's a valley. So you go through this kind of a large hill country for a while, and then it flattens out and becomes this valley, just a few miles from some oasis and some dry riverbeds, with occasionally get some precipitation. But you're going to come across this, and this is the San Jose de Gracia Mission Church in. Basically, it's technically a Chamizal, New Mexico, but it's really Tempe, New Mexico. But as said, there's not much here, and very isolated area. And coming along, suddenly you come across this absolutely fascinating Catholic church, but it's in the adobe style. It has been there in one form since the 1500s, when Spain initially occupied this area, moved up into this area, and set a number of missions throughout New Mexico, California, Arizona, Nevada, some even say up as far as Oregon and Western Washington. And eventually it went through a couple of different evolutions. There's documentation of the final form was probably the 1700s. It was built here. The feature that we're going to be talking about, and where it ties into kind of this modern investigation that we were looking at, is these two bell towers. Now, one bell tower, there would ring out whenever there was a wedding, a christening, a birth, a confirmation, a baptism. That was the of Mary's grace is the translation for it, the bell of Mary's grace. The second tower would ring out when there was a death or a funeral, and that was of the refuge. It attained a nickname, the death bell, and it was stolen, allegedly stolen. We're still looking this one up, in the 1930s, because the rumor was it was cast of a mixture of gold, silver, and other precious metals, and then painted over black to look like cast iron. And to this day, it is still missing. And that's kind of where that interesting historical punchline comes in here. Also in the 1930s, there was a rumor regarding a murder, which became a very famous exploitation film that ran afoul of the Hays Codes, which were the codes that dictated how Hollywood would do their films. And so you would think, why would Hollywood care about what happened in these little remote valleys out here in New Mexico? Well, for that, an interesting clue comes up in an 1880s document. So we're going to remove that off here. And it's absolutely fascinating. So in 1881, there was a Lieutenant Bork from the United States Army. And in those days, the Army was still surveying. There was still very much a Wild West that was in unexplored areas in the United States West. It was still moving in there. It was still developing and settling that area for America. And one of the things that happened was that this Lieutenant Burke, let me go over here to it. And this is found in the National Parks Service history in the Las Trampas area. And it was talking about the colonial church in that area. And from this 1881 Lieutenant Burke report, there's something quite interesting. So I'm going to read a little bit of it here. So when he arrives there, like I said, he was the first Anglo to, at least in memory, to go into this area, this region. And he says that the town was now in its decadence, but still muy bonito, and boasted a church which few Americans had ever seen. With my permission, he would act as a guide to the sacred edifice. He had a guide with a burro. He says, my hasty and imperfect sketch will, I am afraid, give very imperfect idea to the little church, which certainly was not lacking in the elements of simple beauty. And he goes on, but then his guide says, "Es la muerte, death," whispered my guide in awestruck tones. I recognized the fact that I had stumbled upon paraphernalia of some little band of penitentes, those curious religious zealots who, not satisfied with the exactions of Mother Church, seek solace for sorrowing consciences in acts which emulate, if they do not imitate, the conduct of the flagellantes of the Middle Ages. The church authorities, to their credit, be it said, have exerted themselves to the utmost to repress and eradicate this abnormal development of religious fervor. The penitentes have either been driven from the larger towns or compelled to organize into little villages like that in which I now found myself, where ecclesiastical administration was lax or inspection only possible at long and irregular intervals. The penitentes dominate the control of their own village church. To go back to death, the artist had carefully eliminated every trace of beauty from feature or figure, with a result that must have been a gratification to his pride and his own abilities. The statue thus hooded, so he came across a statue we'll show you a photo of here in a minute. The statue thus hooded, armed and painted, was seated upon a wooden wagon, something similar to an artillery limber, but made of the crudest way of wood, fastened with pins of the same material. The wheels were sections of pine trunk, ungreased axles, and ungreased pole made unearthly music to add to the difficulty of hauling such a vehicle. The box seat upon which Death sat as a grim character was filled with smooth, worn, and heavy boulders. On Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and other days in Lent, this ghastly reminder of life's brevity and uncertainty is hauled through the village by two of the most devout penitentes, who, to secure the important place in the procession, have to whip half of the remaining repentant sinners in the valley. So quite the interesting passage there. Now, the penitentes is what we're going to talk about. So this church was created by the penitentes, and they developed a system that was similar to the flagellites in medieval Europe. And there's what he was talking about there, this kind of feature of death, this very crude, it takes all the gilded art out of it, so that they're focusing on the death, from dust you came, from dust you will return, that kind of mindset. But they took it in a very dramatic way. Now, how did they get to that part? We know that the flagellates in medieval Europe came from the Black Death. So initially it started in a village in Italy, and during the period of time in the 14th century, the 13th and 14th century, it began to spread, and it was in a response to the Black Death. And so it was quite interesting that this was going on. And what happened was that eventually the church had to stomp down on it, but it became very, very popular. But why was it over in New Mexico? There wasn't a Black Death going on. There was something else that was still very traumatic for the small community. And it occurred in the 1820s. Now, so from about 1500s till the 1800s, early 1800s, Spain owned this huge section within the New World, including New Mexico. And as I said, they seeded it with missions and churches and that sort of area. But what happened was that this group in 1821 suddenly was unable to be able to get priests. So as when the priest died out, it wasn't being replaced. Why? In Mexico, they had seceded from Spain. And so Mexico was now its own nation, and Spain was no longer sending any of the priests to service the flock, as it were. And so New Mexico suddenly was without priests. And in this void of pastoral care emerged a need to be able to receive or atone for sin. And typically, in my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Catholic tradition, there's something called Eucharist. And in Eucharist, you will take the sacraments, which are the bread and which represents the body, which becomes the body, and if you're a traditional Catholic, and in some places the wine, but sometimes that's just the priest has the wine. But basically, the bread and the wines representing the Last Supper, where Jesus said, "It is my body and my blood," and that was the atonement. So you give your confession, you do your atonement, and then you take the Eucharist, and now you're in a state of grace whereby your sins are truly forgiven, and then you're in a state with the grace of God. So if you pass away, you're going to heaven. But now that's taken away. So by not sending a priest, the priest is the only one that can minister the sacraments and forgive of sins. When they're not there, the communities that believe are now left without a mechanism by which they can clean themselves of sin. So this mortification, this whipping, this flagellization of oneself, this crucifying of oneself is something that sprang up in that area. And you'll see that. So this is a picture from 1888. It's not the lieutenant, but it's another group that went in there to study. Many anthropologists went in there to look at this group because they had become hereditary. So since 1821, when the priest went away, they formed these very small groups usually hereditary through the families in these small communities of the penitentes, the penitentites, that were basically flagellating themselves, recreating the Stations of the Cross, and every year would crucify a member of their flock. Now, there's some debate whether or not the beginning was actually with nails. There is some literary evidence that says that they did, but again, they may have just tied themselves in. You also see this in the Philippines, for example. If you look up penatites, you'll notice that there is a lot of that flagellization in the Philippines. They still do that. There's in literature, Death Comes from the Archbishop. He actually mentions it's kind of a fictionalized history of the building of the St. Francis, I believe it was Assisi in New Mexico Chapel, but he talks about the communities of the penitents and how the church, the Catholic Church, had to again kind of subdue that and get it under control, as it were, because it had gone to extremes, and then the Eucharist was the way of salvation, not flagellization. The other book that was quite interesting that I didn't realize was that Aldous Huxley, A Brave New World, which was a critique, a stinging critique of communism, much like George Orwell's 1984. In that book, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the flagellization, the pentatites, were shown, a video documentary of the pentatites was shown to a class of children in order to inculcate them how crazy and insane the previous world was before basically communism took over. And so it was an extreme example that they would use. So it actually worked its way into literature. It worked its way into some documentaries. It has worked its way into legends and lore in that region and across the United States. As I said, in 1931, there was a murder that took place where an artist or a travel a travel anthropologist or artist, depending on what news source you've read, lived among the Pentadites in New Mexico. And the rumor was in order to protect their secrets, they killed him. And so there was a murder. So the Pentadite community, one member of that community did murder this outsider that was living among them. And it created kind of a news scandal. But it was even overshadowed by the film that came out afterward, which was the Lash of the Pentatites, or the Whip of the Pentatites. And it violated every Hays Code that there was at the time, because the Hays Code had just come out, and it was basically an exploitation film. So there's two versions of that film out there from the 1930s. I believe it's 1932. And the one was just absolutely violating everything in the Hays Code. It was an exploitation film that probably would not be seen in America, that style, until the late 1960s, when the code was relaxed and directors were getting very testing every boundary they could. And then there was an edited version, which eventually made it into the theaters, which looked more like a documentary. And it spliced in a lot of gratuitous exploitation dramatics with actual documentary film footage of the Pentatites doing their ceremonies and whipping themselves and putting each other on crosses. And so two literary references in other books say that they used to actually do the full crucifixion on somebody that volunteered from the community. Others say they just lashed themselves. What the truth is probably something in between. If it is like the Philippines, then some people would say, please give me the full crucifixion, and they would do that. But again, going back to that church out there in New Mexico, about the same time that the film was made, about the same time that the murder investigation was going on about the Pentitite murder, there was also the theft. Go over here. The Bell of Death, as it was known, was stolen, and it was during a period when there was a group of people from outside the community that wanted to come in and renovate the church. And oddly, they're renovating it again now. During that period of time in the 30s, it was rumored that the Bell of Death was stolen and a different bell was put in its place. We're still tracking that one down. We don't know if that's true or not, but it was reported as such. And that's where the story kind of takes an interesting turn. So when the Bell of Death was now stolen, because it was rumored to be silver, gold hybrid, along with some other precious metals, and just painted over to look cast iron, that played into itself. It was a small community, probably not stolen by the community, but the renovators that came in, it might have done that. And it may have been because the outsiders that were financing this renovation may not have received as much return as they thought they perhaps were going to receive. We don't know. All that's conjecture at this point, but it is a key part in what we're about to talk about next. And what happened next was very, very interesting. These show up. That bell showed up, the Bell of Death shows up in the Department of Justice website. and you're going to love this one. The Department of Justice website in relation to the Epstein files. That's right, the Epstein files. So let's see if I can upload that real quick here, and then we'll take a look at that because it was quite fascinating. Yep, here we go. Take 1 second to upload, and we'll look at it here. Again, I'm not a videographer. I am just an investigator. Okay, here we go. So we're going to go ahead and see if we can get this on the full screen layout. And I don't know if you can see it real well on your screen, but this is a document from 2020 from the FBI. It's unclassified. And the interesting part to me was that this was chasing down what they sourced initially as credible. And it was credible for a report that this person had believed that the Jeffrey Epstein house, because Jeffrey Epstein had now gotten into the news, they believed that Jeffrey Epstein, they had seen a magazine article with the Zorro Ranch, which is where Jeffrey's Epstein Ranch in New Mexico is, contained the death bell of the San Jose de Gracia Church in Trampas, New Mexico. And they label it as credible initially. They look into it, and he says that the photos of the ranch show that there was a number of colonial period artwork inside. And there was a person who reported, his name was Timothy Lopez, on 7 November 2019. Timothy Lopez was interviewed and reported that in approximately 2014 to 15, Lopez read an article in a real estate magazine that featured a home with a room filled with Spanish colonial art. In one of the photographs, Lopez noticed a bell that he thought might be the bell missing from Las Trampas Church. Lopez recalled that the missing bell, referred to as the death bell, is slightly smaller and thicker than the bell currently at the church. Additionally, on 4 September 2019, Guardian, he's got a number there, Emilio Martinez, the caretaker of the church, stated one of the church's 2 bells was stolen in the 1930s. And so that's where this actually ties in there. And the Archdiocese of Santa Fe Office of Historical, Artistic, Patrimony, and Archives had only one article in the file pertaining to the Mission Church. The information indicated that one of the bells had been stolen. And it goes on from there. It goes into some other interesting information for you OSINT warriors. They didn't redact the name of the security guards that actually worked there at a certain period of time when it was robbed. It also has the names of 2 of the people that tried to rob the ranch over there in Zorro Ranch. So that was kind of interesting. It's a 10,000-acre ranch. So that's the FBI file. So that's how this little church, the penitentes and everything, tie into that. At least the penitentes had the decency to volunteer and do it themselves and keep it in their community. Epstein, as everyone knows, unfortunately would kidnap people and do horrible things to them outside of that community, and other people would take part. So as much as we look at we might look at the penitentes and the flagellates as an anomaly or something, as Aldous Huxley wrote in his book, to look down upon or laugh to provide our society so much better. Looking now, contrast that with what actually occurred as now is being released in these Epstein documents. We are in some ways far more barbaric than that community up in New Mexico. Far more barbaric. And for what reason, right? One is to cleanse yourself of a perceived sin because you have guilt. The other one is you have no guilt and you are committing sin after sin after sin. All right, off the soapbox now. Let's get down to some map business here. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to look at, put me back up here. All right, so one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the imaging. Now, the Epstein Ranch is actually quite interesting. It's very huge. So if you want to look at it, it's 45 Zorro Ranch Road in Stanley, New Mexico. And actually, let me get onto the new one here. All right. So this is Google Earth, and we're going to look at 45 Zorro Ranch in New Mexico. Of course, we're going to put the layers on there and do it that way. Now, there's a couple things here that's of note. And so we look at this area, and if you're used to surveillance, or excuse me, if you're used to image analysis, or you're used to satellite analysis and things like that, there's some things that the trained eye will be able to recognize. But for the most part, most people won't be able to recognize these features from the top down. If you're skilled at it and you have some experience, you would know it. Otherwise, it just looks like a bunch of buildings and some lines in the dirt. So, but there are some interesting clues. So this is what Google Maps is going to give you from that area at 45 Zorro Ranch Road. And so we're looking at that from the access down here. Always go to your Street View if it's available, which is nice. So you see here a little different environment than up there. We're going to go up here to the entrance to this. And it's just of note. Whoops, we passed the entrance because we're traveling too fast. There we go. All right, and a couple things, of note. There's the no trespassing sign, a couple mailboxes, but the interesting thing is there's a series of gates here. So we have one set of gates, we have two set of gates, and then if you go on the satellite, there's actually three sets of gates going up to this ranch compound. We can also see that there is a large structure here. Later on, we'll go ahead and identify those. Those are radio antennas, kind of a large radio structure for, I believe, aerial navigation, but we'll have to take a look at that. And a very sprawling complex. The other thing you'll notice is the arid. So taking a look at the environment around it, you're going to see it's very arid, right? Not a lot of water. In the desert, you're going to see sometimes lines of green. That's actually either underground water or an intermittent stream, an area where it's going to get a little bit more water than the surrounding areas. So you can actually kind of tell if there's an oasis or if there's a river that goes there or an intermittent stream by that. Or in this case, this is very brown. There's not a lot of water getting out here. But you go over here, and all of a sudden, well, guess what? This compound has a lot of greenery. Trees require a lot of water in this area. This isn't natural. This is definitely irrigated. This is still being used and that sort of thing. So you can sometimes tell, especially in this area, who's wealthy because they'll have a lot of green around their area, right? So that's one thing. But if we go back to the satellite imagery, it looks very brown, right? So it's very interesting. Google will not sometimes give you the best image to interpret. But again, we can see some details in satellite, which you can't see from a street view, or if you're actually doing it, and that sort of thing. So we have the two access points here. Looks like a cattle guard right down there, and then a very long access road coming up. And then you can see lines in the dirt where maintenance or security vehicles would move. And then, of course, the compound itself. There's the radio tower that we're able to see from the road. Now, this is another system I like. So that's okay. We've got this, and that's kind of interesting. Now, when we were looking out here, there was a place that's just about 30 minutes, 35 minutes from the Epstein Ranch. Keep in mind, that's an airfield there, by the way, on his ranch. If you go out here, there's a place called Young's Place. Now, for whatever reason, this got associated when we were doing a search. Now, there's Young Lake, there's Young Place, but it's good for being able to look at details again. When we come down here, again, if you're kind of familiar with being able to look at satellite imagery, you're going to see there's some rundown buildings, right? So we got all these little rundown buildings out here that we're looking at, but it's hard to see. And a lot of people, if they're looking at this, if they're not experienced in it, they may even just think of those rocks, right? Because it kind of blends into the formation around here. These trees, there's the shadow which is cast, the satellite picked up on, because the time of day also impacts what you're going to see, and will change the image. That's very difficult. So it's very difficult to kind of gain what we're looking at here if we wanted to kind of go back in time and figure out what is this and where is it. Now, we looked up the records. You can go on county websites. We're not going to get into that this time, but you can go on county websites and see when people bought land, when they got permits. The assessor's office of every county is going to give you the property lines, because the taxes, as you know, counties are very big about property taxes. They're going to map it. They're going to know ownership, and they're going to have records about when the ownership transferred. The Jeffrey Epstein Ranch way out there on Zorro Lane was 1990s. He bought it in 1995. He applied for improvement permits and began huge construction in that area out there. Young's Place, we're still looking up. We haven't looked at it. But one interesting part that came up, which was just an anomaly, was this photo here by Denise Bevington. She's a contributor. This was taken back in 2016. And this is just one of those 360 cameras that they have. But, sometimes when it's taking it, it'll transpose things. So this is simply the barbed wire that's been transposed up, but it's not actually to scale. But it's just in the middle of nowhere. You can see the remnants of a road here that go up this way. And that's it. So it was like, well, that's interesting. In fact, you get there's her car probably right there that she parked. It's a Land Rover kind of thing. And then she comes over here to take this. Now, always take leads and follow it. And then you get sort of interesting things. So there's a lot of where she's been over here. There's Cyprus, which is interesting. She took pictures of radio towers in Cyprus. She says historical landmarks, which is kind of like, okay. She takes a lot that are called, she doesn't label them. She'll say unknown place, but luckily the EXIF data is still there. So this one's in Germany, so that you can kind of get those. But the interesting things that she had, which was just, again, very interesting to us, was that some of the photos that she had, one of them was on Cyprus of a radio tower. The other one was a area in Chicago, which was an area that she, for some reason, had as a Secret Service spot. So it was an area guarded by the Secret Service. So right across from a synagogue. So it was kind of interesting. I mean, you kind of look more into it, but wasn't that big in there. She's also got something near a couple of them in Israel, mostly the tourist sites, but a few of them are a little more than tourist sites. So maybe nothing, but it was just very interesting. That's one thing you can do is look at these reviews and see what else they have reviewed. If you're looking at a kind of an OSINT or an open source intelligence that you're looking at. So going back to what we were looking at into that Young area, we're going to look at the same place with Young's place, but we're going to look at it from the satellite view. And we're also going to look at the Zorro from a satellite view, but not using Google Maps. So I'll put this in the link when I post this, but it's going to be a really fun map that I use to put side by side. And one of the things that you always do, especially, yes, I'm a human, maybe. Let's see, hats. Well, that kind of looks like a Marine hat. I really need to get rid of these because that's subjective. I'm going to say no, and let's see what it says. Oh, bite me. Oh, curtains, 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 curtains. Okay, here we go. So what you can do on this one is, this is really nice because we taught these before, but a lot of people just joined afterward. This is a side by side where you can actually get different types of satellite, and from different image sources, you're going to get different information, different resolutions, different seasons. So sometimes Google, even on the way back, when you go back, to the satellite photo they took in 2020 or 2017, it may be during winter and it may be some tree cover, so you can't get a visual of what you actually want to look at. And so, okay. So this gives you different photographs from different angles, different seasons, and with different imagery. So it actually works out very, very well for being able to do comparisons. The other thing that I like is that you can actually look on maps, and with this little cursor, it shows you what you're looking at on the satellite. So you can kind of pinpoint a feature and really get in there and get into the nitnoid of it, of what you want to do. So in this case, let's see. We'll start with the Zorro lane. So we'll go back to 45 to 49 Zorro lane. All right, it's going to make me do it the hard way, but that's okay. So actually, hang on a second. I'm going to do this. All right. Now, this is a technique that I like to do, but depending on your time and disposition, you may or may not want to do it. But it's just something I prefer to do. And one of the things I like to do, especially if we're doing investigations on remote areas, is to kind of what we call map drive it. And it would be like as if I was traveling there or flying in there, renting a car, and then going out to that area. You kind of do a map recon of the route that someone would take to go from a large population center to a remote area, and see what's along the way or what's that you're going to find in there. And sometimes you can actually find something it's fairly interesting. So the Epstein Ranch on Zorro Road in Stanley is just south of Santa Fe, and actually you're going to go down 285 and then you go on New Mexico 41. So over here on the right hand side, you're going to see that's the map. So I can actually follow. Okay, there's 285. I'm going out of Santa Fe here, and I'm traveling down. Then I'm going to go on 41. And so I just kind of zoom in so I can see enough of the areas in here, and as if I was in a car, and I'm just like looking at anything on the side of the road as I kind of go down there. And so there's 285. Okay, I think that's 41. Yeah, it's 41 branching out here. All right, East Reserve Properties, Saddleback Ranch. Okay, Santa Fe Conservation Trust. All right, Las Maras. Sometimes you'll find things like military bases nearby that sometimes if you're just doing in the point, you wouldn't find. And this was kind of interesting here. So just kind of halfway between Santa Fe and the ranch, we get something called the Cerro Pelon Movie Ranch, right? So there's that's just en route between Santa Fe going down 41 to the Epstein Ranch. And just on a kind of a lark, I looked it up, and it has its own website. It's newmexicomovieranch.com, and it states that the Cerro Pelon Movie Ranch is one of the most iconic film locations for Western movies in New Mexico. uh, Silverado, Lonesome Dove, 310 to Yuma, The Missing, All the Pretty Horses, Cowboys and Aliens, Wild Wild West, and Thor, among others, were filmed here. And so it's purpose built. It looks like a little Wild West town. So a lot of the a lot of the TV shows and movies you see might have been filmed here. Now, interesting, because a lot of the, for example, the Epstein files dealt with movie things. Is there a possibility that, for example, while they were here filming, they may have been entertained just a few miles south at the ranch? Oh, who knows? But it does provide a lead. So, for example, if you were doing some kind of case like this, well, there's another lead that you can look at and say, well, where were they staying? What were they doing? That kind of thing. If you were investigating that sort of thing for historical purposes, you may look at links with, okay, well, there's a military base north of there. There's a large population center, water, railroad stations, traffic area, something of interest that would tie into the community that's not co-located or located within the community. It's a little bit further away, but it's on a route. So always do that kind of what I call route recon and see what's there that may have been reasonable to travel with, depending on the historical period that you're looking at. Keeping in mind that some areas are railroads and roads that no longer exist, so you have to look at the older ways that you're going to go down and do those. So basically, we just got to travel down here, and then we're going to get in here. And this is kind of nice. I'll take these out for now. Hang on a second. Take that one out. Take this one out. Okay. So now we're here at Zorro Ranch Road, and then I would also do that going down here to the next major highway. But if you notice the Zorro Ranch Road, this is really a kind of a, there's nothing here. It's very rural. And it's nice here because, especially if you're unfamiliar with a lot of the satellite photography, some maps, depending on what you choose on this system, and this is maps.nls.uk, by the way, and it's a National Library of Scotland, but they have a side-by-side geo-referenced maps, which is absolutely wonderful. You'll see here, though, that they have the airport symbol, right? So there's the airport symbol. So if you're unsure of something, there's usually a map out there that you can now compare it and say, oh, well, that's an airport. And then you can go down here to that interesting structure that we saw earlier. Remember from the street? Not that one. There it is. So we see it over here, and then we're zooming in this way, and okay, so that's also radio. So that tells us that is a radio station. Now, of interest is there's another little ranch. You follow this tiny little road out here, and there's another small house in the middle of nowhere, which all through a lot of money. There's a lot of green around that house, and there's a tennis court. But either that's electrical fencing, or I'd have to look up the symbol of that. But that's an interesting symbol to put around a tennis court, right? Like, radios, electric fence. What is that? In this very secured compound. I mean, there's this nice huge wall here, but you're already within a secured area in the middle of nowhere, right? So that's a lot of security for what? And when you look around the area, normal houses, they don't have this kind of thing. Ranchers, big, huge ranch hands, big farms with people with, cattle industry or, the oil industry that they've got. They're not building this unless they got a bunch of neighbors around them they don't like, right? So in this secured area with the airfield and this house and this, there's a lot going on. So it's quite interesting. There's also something else we won't get into, but we looked at the vehicles. And this one, notice, unlike Google Maps, you've got a lot of you got a lot of vehicles in here. A lot of activity showing up. You've got maintenance vehicles. This isn't just normal. You've got some construction equipment that you can see from the satellite. So there's a lot going on here. There's also a lot greener than that Google map image. Remember that? It was pretty brown. So you're going to get a different idea about, okay, what areas are, and you can compare which areas have irrigation built in, right? Which have sprinklers, which have built in, which might be electrical systems in there, which aren't. So there's a lot of detail that you can kind of go in here. And then depending on the satellites, you can also see things like power lines, sometimes where the power lines go, where they may have utilities go in and out. And of course, the road systems, what are being used by roads, sometimes off-road, especially in the desert. It's great because they leave a nice little trail and you can begin to get patterns of life and that sort of thing. Oh, look, there's somebody right there. So this is something that you can do with this one, and then you can compare. So you can go back over here and let's look at, this is all imagery. So there's two things you can do. One is what's called a world map. In this case, they have it with some historical maps of this area. And then this is basically what's now. So this is an open street map on this side. But let's choose this one just to give you an idea about how these things can change. So we're going to go to the Google satellite one. That's the one we saw from Google Maps. And you see how different that looks, right? So, I mean, just that little change is quite interesting. There's the world imagery. So again, we get the green back. We're able to see lots of vehicles that are there. In the FBI files, it actually had aircraft. He had a number of aircraft that were on and where they're stationed. And just north of here in Santa Fe, right, just a few miles north, he had a helicopter registered. That was a Bell, I think it was like a 401. So, basically those little corporate helicopters. And would that be able to land on this airfield? Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Boom. Right. So, in fact, he's got some space. So you could probably put a couple Cessnas in there. That's easy to land with some Cessnas, some RGs and everything. So, yeah. He would be able to fly that helicopter from Santa Fe out here. If somebody flew in, he would be able to fly somebody from that little movie star ranch or the movie ranch set that we saw up there. So really a lot going on down here that's fascinating, but it's easier to see when you switch between different imagery. So there's the ESRI. Here we go. There's a Google satellite hybrid. Doesn't really give you much, but it gives you some contrast. So now you can kind of get a better feel for depth of the houses. Is it a 2-story? Is it a 1-story? With the shading, you can begin to look at those sorts of things. Gives you a little bit better idea, but you notice this looks abandoned, right? There's no cars here. You couldn't tell if there's any activity until you went to another satellite, and then you get a little bit better idea about that. Map tier satellite hybrid gives, there's some more greenery there. There's one vehicle, but doesn't have all the activities of vehicles that we saw before, including the vehicle coming up the range there. And it gives you a little bit better details of some areas, but other areas it loses detail. So, but the point being is you can flip back and forth and get a better idea about what you're looking at when you're able to kind of do that changes in these maps. Now for historical, see that? So you get a little different there. So just flip back and forth till one gives you the information that you want. Not all of them are satellites. Some of them are this, but again, we get those interesting there's a symbol there, right? So in the county, they were looking up this, and so they've surveyed it. And so that's what you're going to get here, right? With the topographical map. So you have some sort of radio station there. You got radio navigational signal there. You've got your airfield up there with the building. And now we've got a little bit better map down here, right? So it kind of reflects that. So these are different things that you can do, comparing and try to see what that is. You can look up a building and then keep going in for more detail and pinpoint exactly what you're looking at. So that was kind of interesting. I wanted to share that with everybody on here. This topographical for elevation. I'm going to show you one more thing with I don't like hill shading. Let's go back to there we go. One more thing with the historical. So let's see what was out here before. We had the county assessor's office where you got this in the mid 1990s and began 1995, got a building permit to be able to do all that. But let's now go into the historical. So let's look at the world. And this is the Errol Smith map from 1790. It looks blank, but until you kind of zoom out. But it'll tell you where that ranch is today, right? So back in the day, there's Santa Fe. There's no road there. The road actually went over here to a place that looks like it's called Panvi. I have to look that up. Poroy, Zia, and you're basically following that river down, right? So the civilizations are on the river, especially in arid climates. You're going to stick near there, or in their mitten streams and rivers. But there's nothing out here, right? And so that's kind of of note. Is that okay? What was back there at that point, and now, and then to verify, you can go back in, and oh look, there's an Air Force base. Huh. So as you kind of go back in here to 41. There's the airfield. So we put a little cursor here and we zoom out, making sure that cursor stays on the right. And that's how you can find out where historically something was. So was there a town there? No. Was there a road through there? No. It was very remote. Now, again, with the Epstein thing, of course, there wouldn't be anything in there at 1790. But if we were looking up, for example, that church where we were before with the death bell, that might be of interest. And then moving forward, here's the 1881. So this is the map when the Lieutenant Burke was traveling around and he wrote that travel log about the church in Arizona, or excuse me, in New Mexico that had the death bell. This was the Arizona, or excuse me, the New Mexico that he was looking at, right? This is probably information that he was looking at for that. So we have a railroad that comes down through there. There's Albuquerque. We still don't have anything down through where's Highway 41 now to kind of get that detail about where the Epstein Ranch now is. So again, this is just kind of interesting to kind of go through. And if you're doing a historical investigation, this is what you do. Some areas have a lot more detail. You can actually load in some cases, your own maps, historical maps of an area. They have to the city, the plat maps. They have insurance maps of every building in some cities, so you can see who owns property ownership over time. These are useful for property disputes that you're able to kind of look at those. So again, this is just a technique, and it's free. We'll put the link in there, but if you're writing it down, it's maps.nls.uk /geo/explorer/side-by-side. And then play around with it, and you can have some fun with it, and then kind of see what has changed over time. And especially in developed areas, like in England and things like that, you can kind of look at old railroad areas and say, well, there's nothing there now. Like this was a railroad crossing area, and it's just nothing. You can see where it used to be over on the right, but nothing there now. But back in the day, looks like it was probably a busy intersection. So that's one thing that we can do. There's a few others, but we will talk about them later. Again, any questions, feel free to ask, but that is just one technique. And again, how sometimes the threads of history going from a 1500 church, 1500 building of a church in the middle of Spanish New Mexico, of Spain-owned New Mexico, has a very interesting culture around it that developed with the Penitentites, and how that changed and where it actually connects within various historical areas, and where it ties into even things today that you might not even think about. And again, why we like historical investigations, because some techniques and some threads that you follow actually are very good for being able to use in some skills that we do even in modern day investigations. So hopefully that helps. We'll go ahead and do this. And again, any questions, go ahead and put stuff in the comments, or send them to me. A bunch of people are got my email now, so they're sending me all kind of questions. We're happy to help on that. If you're another investigator, historical investigator, historian, or private investigator, let me know. So happy to help. So anything that you guys need, let me know, and we'll help out with that. So hopefully that was kind of fun and useful. I still do out 2 things after I do finish off my actual clients caseload for today. We're going to do Somaliland. We're going to talk about that. That's very interesting because, again, the historical lines, people think, oh, it's new and oh, this is terrible. And what's Somaliland? It's Israel recognized Somaliland, but Somaliland was created by the British. The Italians had Somalia, the British had Somaliland, and it's routes and resources. So the same groups have done it. We found evidence with Rome, that same area. Rome was actually going for it. They had an outpost out that area. So this goes on for generations. You'll find these same areas that we're looking at on maps are still very important today. They're still absolutely necessary today for being able to look at what's going to be needed in the future, right? So there may be a pause now, nobody really cares about it, but in the future it's going to be there, right? And you can find those a lot of times on maps. You'll see those same systems, those same trade routes will starts off with a Roman road, then it goes to a railroad, then it goes to a highway, and then now it's going to be fiber optic lines because they're moving information along pretty much same geographical lines to population centers, and they need resources and things like that. So a lot of this is very old, but people sometimes will miss the history of it. But it's very important to kind of say, okay, what actually happened in Somalia and Somaliland, especially with the conflict between the two, and what's going on, and where that may have come from, and kind of seeded. This is the Italian, this is the British, and then the tribes have been fighting forever, but they just get exacerbated because what happened later. So we'll talk about Somaliland, what's been going on since 1991. The U.S. of course famously went into Somalia, not Somaliland. Somalia with Mohammed Farah Aidid. Some kind of surprises, like his son that eventually took over was in the U.S. Marines at the time we were hunting his dad, and he was in Somalia. So that would have been interesting to be his unit to kind of say, oh, hey, we're looking for your dad, by the way. So just some weird coincidences, but yeah, the famous Black Hawk Down incident, the day of the Ranger in October, we'll talk a little bit about that, but basically the broad history of Somalia, Somaliland, and what may be some paths in the future based on the historical. So that's one. The second one we're going to talk about, and it is a continuation of what we talk about here a lot, which I think is very important to kind of tune down the heat. And that will be on the Zionism. A lot of times it's misunderstood, and no more so than like 2 days ago when there was a person that was on a religious freedom council that Donald Trump set up as executive freedom council, and honestly and this is a Jew, was like, nope, this Zionism is not religious, right? And so some people have made it that, but it never started out that way. And as it exists in the nation state of Israel, it's not. There's people that believe it and go there, but functionally, what Zionism we're talking about, right? There's a small religious group that created Zionism. Later, there's an older religious group that's Zionism that said, okay, we're going to change the definition of what it is to now fit into this. Now that there's a nation there, we got to change it. But I think it's important to understand there's a lot of myths out there that just need to go away because it's creating tremendous strains and stresses, which will probably lead to violence, massive violence against Jews again. But because people are supporting the Zionism idea, they think they're protecting them, but it's not, creating a massive double standard and an obvious dichotomy that will result in violence, right? So in other words, when there's two tiers of reality, people don't respond to that real well, and they tend to react against it. And I think it's important just be honest in what the facts are, and here it is. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's going to be a separate item. This one I just want to show the techniques out there because I enjoy maps. I love doing that map route recon, see what you got on the way, and then saying, okay, well, somebody driving down that road, they're close to Epstein. If you got a whole bunch of Hollywood folks right there in the ranch up the street, they can visit the ranch down in Epstein Island. So I'd be curious, the cast and crew on some of those shows that were filmed there, did they make a pit stop? So it's kind of interesting to see. It's very sad, but there it is. I'm far more interested, I think, in some of the penitence and that kind of thing. When you take away grace from someone, they will find another mechanism by which they are cleaning their sins, and then they go through this process. So that's fascinating to me. We'll look more into that. If you're interested in that, I'll dive into that. I know our Prester John article was actually very popular. It's just absolutely fascinating, the history of religion that just gets overlooked a lot. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And we will see you actually maybe in an hour.